So hello again, everyone, and welcome to the first event of Anderson's Embracing Diversity Week 2021. My name is Courtney Chung. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a second-year full-time student at Anderson, graduating in 2022. So I have had the honor of being the VP of Programming on the EDW Planning Committee over the past 6 months, and it's been so rewarding to see this entire week of events come to life. As someone whose career prior to Anderson centered in the education nonprofit spaces, I came to the MBA program wanting to develop skills that would broaden the impact that I could make, particularly through the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this was a huge part of the reason why I chose to get involved in the EDW Planning Committee and other EDI initiatives at Anderson. And I realize my role makes me highly biased in wanting all of you to be present at this event right now. But I'm also very grateful that you are here supporting EDW, because your showing up does make a difference in the future work that the Anderson community commits to pushing forward more diverse, inclusive, and equitable spaces for students from all different backgrounds. So thank you so much for your support. And before I pass this off to our speaker for today, a few logistics and technical things. First, please do connect with us on social media. So this is a fully virtual event, so we'd love to see your photos, engagement with UCLA Anderson on LinkedIn and or Instagram. For both of those, it should be the school's full name as the handle. And second, we have a raffle going on over this week for some dope swag from some of our student clubs. So please be sure to follow at UCLA Anderson on Instagram and share about EDW with the hashtags Leading Across Difference or Embracing Diversity Week, and tag us for a chance to win some cool things. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Anderson alumna and leadership coach, Sana Rahim.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. I see some familiar faces. I see Carolyn Anderson, who worked on my profile when I was Wooden Fellow. I see Michael Hernandez, who's one of my team members at Brightwheel. It's nice to see you. And then I saw, who else did I saw? I saw someone else that I recognized. Oh, I saw Dean Stafford, who was our dean when I was in FEMBA. So nice to see some familiar faces. And super thank you to Courtney and Sophia for inviting me. Courtney and I just connected for like a career conversation, which, by the way, like for all the UCLA folks here, like please leverage the network. Like I feel like I've rarely turned down a UCLA student when they wanted to talk to me about my career or any like advice I might have, especially because I think the DEI space is a kind of growing one, and there's a small group of us who have entered into this space from the UCLA alumni network. So definitely lean onto the network and support. But yeah, Courtney and I chatted, and this is what resulted in me being here for today. So thank you so much for making space for me and inviting me back. I have a very sweet spot for UCLA Anderson in my life. It was a really big life-changing, career-changing couple of years for me. I made some big moves and changes during that time. So if you're at Anderson, believe that anything is possible. And like, it is really a magical time to just like rethink your career and kind of the possibilities and the things that are in front of you. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and dig in. I do want to share up front that I'm not one of those speakers that just talks for 40 minutes straight. Like I will want this to be as interactive as possible. And like, it seems like we have a pretty nice sized group where we can actually hopefully engage in conversation and dialogue. So if you're comfortable and able to, I'd love to see your camera on just so we can see each other, engage in dialogue, discuss, like really dig in here, but totally okay if you're on the move or don't feel comfortable or prefer not to turn your camera on, that's also okay as well. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. I have a little bit of a deck that we'll use to kind of walk through. Can everyone see my screen okay? Can I get a thumbs up if you're able to see it? Okay, great. All right, so our session is about leading with candor and courage, inclusive leadership. So inclusive leadership, I think, is one of those buzzwords that we're hearing all the time today. It's like one of those catchy things that Harvard Business Review loves talking about now, and like all these articles, leaders, speakers. It's one of those things that a lot of people are now focusing in on as one of the key capabilities of leaders of the future. So I want to really dig into this today and talk about what this means kind of from my perspective, and also share some actual, ideas with you on what steps you can start taking to be a more inclusive leader. A quick background on me, which I shared a little bit of already, but I was a FEMBA. I graduated in 2019. When I came into Anderson, I was actually not in the people and DEI space. I was in management and operations, and then did some short-term independent consulting around DEI and L&D and people topics. And then I actually landed a first kind of people ops hire role at a startup in San Francisco called Freckle Education, which was an education technology company. I led them through an acquisition into a bigger ed tech company, and then I exited after that. And now I'm at another education technology company startup, Series C. Just had a pretty significant fundraise, and a senior HR business partner leading our DEI and L&D efforts. On a personal level, I also want to pause. And I think, by the way, this is kind of one of those things I hope as inclusive leaders we're starting to practice, is talking about our identities in these spaces and how they shape our experiences. On a personal level, I'm a first generation American. My parents immigrated from Pakistan, and I'm also a Muslim woman. And I think those identities, in business school and the tech space, right, have definitely shaped my experiences and, shape how I operate in the world and how I navigate. And so that's also a little tidbit about kind of how I'm entering into this conversation as someone who's often the only person that looks like me in a lot of the spaces I'm in day to day. So that's a little about me, and my pronouns are she, her. So in terms of our objectives for today, I have kind of three main things I'd really like to walk through. I want to first nail down on a definition of inclusive leadership. Like I said, it's something that we're always throwing around. So I'd really like to dig into, like, what do we mean when we say inclusive leadership? Like, what do we really mean? What does that really translate into, like, tangible behaviors and actions? I also then want to dig into why this is hard but also important. I also think sometimes in DEI conversations, we glaze over, like, it's this very motivational, inspirational, it's the right thing to do, it's beautiful, it's so wonderful to have so much diversity in the workplace. But I don't think there's often enough conversation and pause to acknowledge how complex and challenging this work is as well, right? So I really want to dig into that for a moment. But then I won't leave you in the lurch. I won't just leave you with how hard it is. I actually also want to share some ideas on very specific actionable behaviors and practical steps. I hope these are real things you can start doing today, tomorrow, and start practicing to start your inclusive leadership journey. So those are our learning objectives. Throughout the conversation, I'll be monitoring the chat. So pop things in there. If I'm not able to get to it during the conversation, I will try to table it for the end for a deeper Q&A session. I'll try to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end just for Q&A, comments, reflections. But there will also be several moments where I'll pause and ask you all to react or questions or what's coming up for you. So it's meant to be interactive, like I said, but please feel free to participate in the chat, or if there's moments where I'm pausing, you can also turn on your mic and share out loud, whatever feels more comfortable for you. It's meant to be inclusive. So whatever way of participation feels good for you, I'm open to that. Any questions on kind of why we're here, what we're going to do together for the next 45 minutes or so? Everyone feel good? Okay. All right. So first participation moment. What is inclusive leadership? What are some of the things that come to mind when you hear this term? Feel free to pop in the chat some of the things that come to mind. And also, if you want to unmute, I could have a couple of people share out loud as well. What comes to mind when you think about inclusive leadership? Be visible, listen. Leading with empathy. Understanding. Leading for different types of people, work styles. Welcoming, including different perspective. Identifying bias and addressing its impact. Humility, leveling the playing field. Empathy and consideration. The chat's blowing up. This is great. Welcoming originality. Making sure everyone's voice is heard, making people feel heard. Yeah, so there's lots of positive things. Really, this is a lot of good things that you all are naming here. So I'm hearing some of the things about making people feel heard, making sure everyone is able to be successful, empathy, accounting for different work styles, experiences, lived experiences, making sure everyone has a voice, humility, right? So these are some of the things that I'm going to touch on, but I'm going to share a working definition for inclusive leadership so that we have kind of a shared understanding of what we're talking about here for the rest of the session. And it sums up a lot of the things that you've already touched on. So this is a definition I wrote, so it's not anywhere else, I don't think. But based on some of the research I've read and kind of some of the work I've done, I think this is how I think about inclusive leadership. So it's leadership that fosters psychological safety, equity, and objectivity on a team, resulting in an environment where bias is minimized and dissenting opinions and unique ideas are utilized for decision-making. So I'm going to pause and let that sink in. I know there's a lot of words there, but essentially a leadership style where people feel psychologically safe, where there's a sense of equal opportunity to, succeed and participate. We're making objective decisions. Where ultimately like bias is reduced. It's never 100% not there, but it's reduced. And dissenting opinions are actually utilized, right? We're actually really leveraging opinions that are different than ours. So let's break this down a little bit further into more bite-sized takeaways, kind of breaking down some of these buzzwords. So psychological safety. Psychological safety is when people actually feel that they really belong and they feel like it's actually safe to disagree. So dissenting opinions, to disagree or push back on the status quo without fear of negative repercussions. I really want to hone in on psychological safety because it's, I think, probably the most important thing for your culture if you are trying to drive a culture of inclusion. So I'm going to pause and say that again. I think this is the most important thing when it comes to driving a culture of inclusion. It's also the most important thing if you actually want to leverage the benefits of diversity. So the entire business case around diversity is, if I bring people from different lived experiences, stories, identities, backgrounds, they will all inevitably have different opinions, experiences, ideas. And so when I bring that many different ideas into one room, I'm going to leave with a much better idea than I came with, right? That's the business case for diversity in a nutshell. What happens if you don't have a culture where people actually feel like they can disagree? What happens to the benefit of that diversity? If I bring in 10 people who think very different things and who have very different opinions, but there's ultimately not a culture where we can actually have a healthy debate. Saw someone pop in the chat. I'm going to open it up. We ultimately can't, there's no freedom to express opinions. And we've also missed out on the business benefit of diversity, right? So I always tell companies, you can hire all day long. You can hire all the diversity if you want, but if your culture is not in one where people feel psychologically safe and there isn't a culture where I can dissent and disagree, even if that's disagreeing with the most powerful person in the room, it's not going to actually benefit the business, right? You're basically just going to keep collecting diversity without actually any benefits. So that's psychological safety. The second piece is equity, and a couple of you mentioned this in the chat when you thought about what comes to mind for inclusive leadership. This is really where you're talking about access to participating, right? So are you actually creating spaces and meetings or whatever they are where everyone actually can access those meetings and participate? So again, you go back to diversity, you can hire all the diversity you want, but if your decision makers are 10 people who are all at the top of the hierarchy and tend to have generally homogenous experiences, you've actually really reduced the equity in the business where people actually have access to participate and influence the outcomes and the decisions of the business, right? So equity is really thinking about the barriers to participation and the success. And I always pause and say equity is different than equality, right? Equality is treating everyone exactly the same regardless of their circumstances. Equity is recognizing that everyone is different and access to participate looks different for each person, right? So that's equity. I'm going to link up the two together because objectivity and bias kind of go hand in hand, right? But objectivity is basically that we are making decisions based on facts and evidence, not just our gut and intuition. I want to pause here and say, I'm not saying never trust your gut or never lead with intuition. I think there's actually some real benefits of making decisions on your gut and going with intuition. But we also have to be very aware that our gut intuition are often very biased, right? We have unfair belief systems, for better or for worse. All of us have them. I have them, you have them, everyone has bias. Whenever someone tells me that they've really worked out their bias and they don't think they have any anymore, I'm like, okay, that's bias. There's another bias that you think that you don't have a bias to deal with. So everyone has bias. All of us are carrying around these belief systems that we've learned, whether we like it or not, that are shortcuts and kind of have led us to some preferences or kind of inclinations we have that sometimes lead us to very unfair, unethical decisions. So we have to be willing to say, like, yes, my gut intuition is saying this, but am I willing to challenge myself with some facts and evidence to make sure I get to the most objective decision? This is also really critical for inclusive decision making, right? Because ultimately, like, if 5 stakeholders are telling you you're wrong, all these pieces of evidence point that we need to take that direction, but you say, well, my gut is telling me this, or I've actually heard some leaders say, like, I have a killer instinct when it comes to this. I know that this is the right thing, right? If we lead with instinct a whole lot, we're inevitably going to be pretty exclusive in how we're making decisions. So these are what I would say, like, the magic ingredients to thinking about inclusive leadership. Do you have a culture of psychological safety, equity, and objectivity? And have you really minimized opportunities for bias? I'll pause there. Questions or concerns or comments on our definition of inclusive leadership and also kind of the inputs I'm talking about here. Feel free to unmute or pop in the chat. Do we agree with this definition? We feel good about it. Can I get some thumbs up? You're feeling good about this definition. Okay. Let me just make sure there's nothing in the chat. Nope. Okay, let's keep moving. So this all sounds wonderful. Like, right, inclusive leadership sounds great. Like, let's be bias-free, let's be super objective, let's make everyone feel psychologically safe, let's deal with all these different opinions. Like, this sounds like cake, right? Like, this seems like this is all what we should all be doing every day. Like, right? Ideally, this is what we're doing. What's hard about this? Let's get super real. What's really hard about being inclusive, about dealing with diversity, dealing with dissent, making sure everyone can participate, dealing with objectivity, not going with our gut and our instincts? Like, what's really hard about this? Let's, like, name the hard things here. Feel free to pop in the chat or turn your mic on and share out loud. We have to unlearn everything. Emotions, exclamation point, vulnerability, letting go of your personal bias. It can be difficult. What else? What else is hard about all this stuff? You have to slow down. Yeah, this is expensive. It's much easier to make a decision based on your gut than have to slow down and do all this other work. Bias is insidious. We don't even know we have it. Balanced listening and making sure we're moving quickly and making decisions. Change is hard, constantly learning, different personalities, right? So I think it's really important with these conversations around DEI, diversity inclusion, equity, inclusive leadership. I don't think there's sometimes enough recognition of how truly hard this stuff is. Day in and day out in the workplace, I'm dealing with questions around diversity, equity, inclusion from, across different processes in the workplace. And it's incredibly challenging work. This is really, really tough work. And so I think, like, we have to really embrace that head on. Like, if we really want to be inclusive leaders, we have to be willing to say, like, this is going to be hard and I have to be willing to do the work, right? This is not like something you wake up with one day. So it's not like you're going to attend this workshop and then tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and be like, I'm an inclusive leader. Like, I've cracked the code, right? It's work. Like, this is really just an invitation to a lot of work that we all have to do, right, going forward. So let me name some really specific things about why this is hard, right? Why diversity poses actually a lot of challenges. It's just, like, way easier to work with people who agree with you, right? Most of us are not naturally prone to, like, really loving when people disagree with us or challenge us. Like, I think there's been occasionally some people that I've met that, like, really invite disagreement. But typically, like, I personally like hanging out with people who tend to, like, think I'm pretty smart and think that I know what I'm doing, right? It's actually pretty difficult to actively invite people into your space who might think very differently than you, right? It's like the lunch table scenario. When you look around at who's eating lunch with who, people like likeliness. Like, people like hanging out with people who generally have similar lived experiences and, like, similar approaches to things. So we can talk about diversity all day long, and most of us love talking about diversity, but the reality is it actually creates a lot more complexity, right? When you have 10 people who are homogenous, you make decisions pretty quick, you tend to agree, and like you move on. When I have 10 stakeholders that think completely different, the meeting's gonna be longer, there's gonna be a lot more debate, we're probably gonna have to do more analysis, and it'll probably take us longer to get to the right decision, right? So there's some real cost to diversity in terms of the cost of the organization. I think the second piece is, and this is something that I deal with all the time as a DEI leader, is like most of us don't, really deeply understand how people's different lived experiences change how they might be thinking about things at work, right? So like it's super uncomfortable today to think about this. Most people lean away from it, right? Like they don't necessarily want to think about, well, like I'm managing 5 people. I know like I have one person of color on this team. I know that probably means something, that this person is the only person of color on this team, but it's difficult to dig into that. We'd prefer to shy away from it and say like, I'm just going to assume Courtney's doing fine. I know she might not be fine, but it is what it is. Like, I don't really want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I'd rather just like let her do her work rather than try to dig into, hey, Courtney, like, do you feel like you're an equal member of the team? Like, I know that you're the only person that looks like you out of the entire team. Is there something to that? It's just something I have to, that's actually a very difficult conversation and we prefer not to have it, right? Typically. And then the last piece is bias is really tricky, right? It takes a lot of time to get into self-reflection to actually be aware of your biases. I have worked with so many people who are hell-bent on the fact that they don't have biases, right? What they hear is, I'm telling you that like you're a racist. I'm not telling you you're a racist. I'm telling you we all have mental shortcuts and belief systems that create unfair outcomes, right? And so be willing to sit with yourself on like your lived experience, like where were you born? What were you taught? What were you raised? Who is your close circle of family? Who's your close circle of friends? Have all those things shaped why you believe what you believe, right? That work of digging in is actually quite hard. And a lot of people would rather not do it, right? And so I actually just really want to sit with this and name this. This is really hard. This is not, work that can be done on the surface. This is not work that anyone can do for you. This is not work like that someone can hand you a script or hand you the directions, right? I'll be candid, right after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of DEI leaders felt like people were looking at us to give them directions. It's like people were like, tell me like how to become an inclusive leader. Like, tell me what I got to do. What are the steps I got to follow? What's the checklist so that I can like be on the right side of this thing? And for a lot of us, it was like, well, actually, I don't have a script. I don't have directions. I need you to like dig in. Like, where are you at in this journey? Like, what do you bring to this conversation? So I really, want to hold space for that, but I also want to hold space for the fact that we have to stay the course, right? Even if this work is hard, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's something we'd rather avoid because it makes life more complicated in some ways, it's the right thing to do, right? As a woman of color, I have felt the benefits of inclusive leadership myself, and I think for other people on the team who come from underrepresented backgrounds, like we know how life-changing, how game-changing it can be when you have a leader who's willing to build inclusion into how they lead, right? It's magical. It's truly magical. And then I think from a business standpoint, we know that this is going to be a defining characteristic of success in the future, right? It's not really a choice anymore. Like this is a part of the fabric of what employees, what talented people are looking for. They want to work for leaders and companies that care about inclusion, are willing to do the work, right? So, this is not an invitation to check out. If you're like, oh, this is too hard, I'm just gonna not do this. Like, can I sign off this workshop? It's more like we have to acknowledge this is gonna be hard, but we have to stay the course, right? And we have to be willing to do the work. So I know I used courage and candor in the headline of my workshop, and this is why, because inclusive leadership requires courage and candor. There's no way to do this work without being brave, without being courageous, and also without being willing to have difficult conversations, without willing to be candid and real with ourselves. So I have a little bit like of a personal reflection questions that I want you to sit with and consider. It's kind of like an acid test, right? Are you willing to really dig into inclusive leadership? And so I'm going to ask you like several questions. And what I'd like you to do is just actually like pause, maybe take your hands off your keyboard, like sit back, put your feet on the ground. I really want you to reflect on this. Like, where are you at with these things when it comes to inclusive leadership? So just to be mindful for a moment and just really, really think. So are you willing to be uncomfortable? Are you willing to be wrong? Are you willing to receive feedback? Are you willing to take ownership for your impact, even if you had positive intentions? Are you willing to become more aware of your biases? Are you willing to learn more about the lived experience of others? Are you willing to reckon with your privileges? I just want to pause here. I'm curious if anyone has any reflections or takeaways before we move on. Feel free to pop it in the chat. I'm just curious kind of what's coming up for folks as they think about the gravity of this work and why it's hard, but still being willing to take on the course. What's coming up for everybody? Anyone brave want to share out loud? I'm really good at awkward silences, so I'll just give it another 30 seconds. I'm curious if there's anyone who wants to share any reflections. In the chat too, discomfort is challenging without a path forward. Yeah. The path forward is coming. I know I have you sitting in some discomfort right now. I have some advice. I won't just leave you like this. Wouldn't it be great if I just signed off now and was like, good luck, figure it out. What else is coming up for folks right now as you're sitting in discomfort? Carolyn, I think you raised your hand.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
I think that the first four are challenging because we all have a memory of being uncomfortable, of being wrong, and being called on it. So when I look at, like 4 and 5, I'm willing to become more aware of my biases. That would be edifying. Sure, I want to learn about other people, but the rest of them require you to take such responsibility for things that you might have screwed up in the past, or that you didn't feel you screwed up, but your knee-jerk is, well, somebody blamed me for something that I shouldn't have been blamed for. So these are, to be perfectly candid, these are all like, I don't know that I can answer immediately yes to all of these questions. And I think that's what you're driving at, is that we have to.
Yeah, thanks for being honest and candid and saying that and naming that. I can tell you, like, that's exactly right. A lot of people are very open to like attending trainings, like digging into bias, like taking those bias tests. Like people like get excited to take those. But whenever there's a moment where like we've not done something right, we've hurt someone, we've made an error in how we spoke to someone or interacted with someone, or we took an action that really impacted someone's sense of safety or belonging, it actually is quite difficult to sit with that and receive that and then reckon with the feedback and figure out what we have to do from there, right? And that's actually where I would say like the real muscles come around inclusive leadership, right? And that's also like, to me, in some ways, the litmus test for inclusive leadership, because there's a lot of leaders that will talk about this, super excited about it, but the second they're being held accountable, they're like, woo, I don't know about this. This is hard, this is uncomfortable. So thanks for naming that, Carolyn. What else is coming up for folks? Anything else? Anyone else want to share anything that's coming up for them? All right, we can keep moving. So now my question is, based on the discomfort I just put you through and really asking you some tough questions and asking you to kind of reckon with the difficulty of this work, my question is, are you in? Is everyone in to continue on the journey and dig in here? I'd love to see some thumbs up. Is everyone in to proceed? Yeah. Okay. So you're opting in. That's great. So now I'm going to, I know we have about 25 minutes left. I'm going to actually talk through, this is where I'm going to share some actual advice, right? And share some specifics on what you can start to do to start the journey. I wanted to focus in on 3 processes that all of us are in, right? Wherever you work, whatever industry you're in, you're participating in meetings, you're hiring and promoting people, and you're dealing with one-on-one conversations with your team members, your direct reports, your peers, whoever it is, right? So I really want to think about how can you center inclusion in these 3 kind of key business processes that all of us participate in. So the first one is meetings. So I really want to pause and talk about meetings. Meetings is where we spend the bulk of our time, right? In life, we spend a lot of time in meetings. And now in Zoom, meetings is basically like how we're experiencing the culture of wherever we work, right? It's experiencing like the people, the leaders, the way we make decisions, the way we talk about things, the way we deal with dissent. So like meetings are actually like probably one of your most important processes as an organization. Like, how do you meet? How often do you even think about how do you meet, right? How are you hosting a meeting? I specifically said hosting, right? Rather than attending or whatever it is. Like, how are you hosting your meetings? How are you hosting conversation? Meetings are also typically the make or break of whether or not people feel seen and heard. So if you have really good meetings, people walk out feeling energized, feel like their expertise was leveraged, they feel like they were heard, they were consulted, or they feel like they sat in on a presentation and were wondering why they were in the meeting anyway, like why were they invited? Right. I feel like those are usually the 2 realities of meetings. And sometimes people are like, that could have been an email. I had no real reason to sit there for an hour. I could have read all those updates somewhere else, right? So how are you actually hosting meetings? I have a couple of pieces of advice on how to make these more inclusive experiences. I think the first piece is like, how often are you actually creating an agenda and sending it out in advance? Everyone operates differently. Everyone thinks differently. If you're really trying to just kind of drive an inclusive meeting experience, give everyone a chance to prepare. Like, send the agenda out in advance. Be very clear on what you're looking for in the meeting. Are you looking to have a discussion on the decision? Are you looking to execute on the decision? Like, what is it that you're trying to get done during the meeting? And let everyone prepare and kind of process so that, you know, everyone's coming in with equal preparation. Sometimes what happens is like 2 or 3 stakeholders have been super involved in the whatever the meeting will be. And then they invite a couple people in, and those people are basically trying to catch up and may not actually have the ability to participate the way they'd like because they're truly just trying to get caught up on what's been going on so far, right? So making sure everyone has an equal baseline to the degree that you can to start off the meeting. Then the second piece is like, how are you actually inviting participation and incentivizing dissent, right? Like, how are you discussing? Who's sharing the opinions? Who's not talking? Who is talking? Is it balanced? I always say for the facilitator should be looking to see, like, you know, we should actually see most people participate in a meeting. If we have like 10 attendees, which I always say like 5 is usually the max at which you start losing some utility over 5, but are all 5 people talking? Is it one person talking, right? Who's taking up the airtime? And then also, how are you incentivizing dissent, right? Like, are there actually spaces or pauses where you say, like, does anyone disagree with this? Are we on the right track? Are you asking open-ended questions to spur debate? And I think related to that is, like, if you're the most powerful person in the room, don't talk first. I actually had to tell like one of my CEOs that is like, the second you share your opinion, like the debate shuts down. Like, it's just, everyone's like, oh, okay. Like, that's what this person wants to do. Like, let's all start aligning on the path towards that. So I actually actively told him, like, don't talk until everyone has done talking. Like, maybe the meeting should be like the first 45 minutes is the team is discussing. And then maybe the last 10, you share your insight based on hearing the robust conversation, right? Anchoring bias is a real thing. Once the most powerful person in the room has weighed in, everyone else will anchor around that idea. And it becomes harder and harder to move away from the anchor. Like, if someone actually was like way far away and had a completely different idea, they're probably far less likely to share it because the most senior member of the team has weighed in. So those are some general ideas on meetings. And I think with Zoom, right, like, just, we can't always understand people's body language via Zoom, but like, pay attention, like, whose camera's on, whose camera's off. If there's someone who's always camera off in a meeting, follow up with them like, hey, what's going on? I really want you to participate. I really value your insight. And I just feel like I'm not actually able to like engage with you. Or if someone's been unmuting and keeps getting interrupted, pause and say, Dylan's been trying to participate and he's turned off his mic a few times, but we haven't been able to hear him. Let's like stop and really hear from Dylan, right? So as if there should be someone actively facilitating who's watching out for all these things. So every meeting should have a facilitator, and these are some of the things that they should be paying attention to really drive an inclusive meeting conversation. Questions and comments on meetings. Anything? I would say like doing a really good diagnostic of your meetings is a really good diagnostic of your culture. Like if you have excellent meetings, you probably have a really great culture. If your meetings are like not going so well, there's probably some cultural opportunities that, you know, for improvement as well. All right, let's move on. Now I want to talk about another issue that's kind of a hot button topic in the diversity inclusion space is hiring and promotions, right? Just talent planning and how we're doing that. Hiring is and promoting both hiring, kind of external hiring, internal promotions. This is probably one of the processes that is most susceptible to bias. This is like where your bias will get you into really bad places unless you have really, really good processes to control for bias. So I really want to invite you to kind of think about that, is think about like how is bias creeping up in how you're hiring people and how you're promoting people. If I think about external hiring, one of the big learnings in the space on DEI around hiring is like we have to really start focusing our interviews on skills and experience, not how much we like the candidate, right? So for a really long time, we did behavioral interviews where we would ask people like, tell me about yourself, tell me about a difficulty you overcome, tell me like what's your biggest weakness, tell me about a big success and achievement. While they were good ways to like get to know someone, those are actually like super ripe opportunities for bias to creep in because we're human. And when someone's story impresses us and we feel like we're inspired by that story, connected to that story, we like the person and we start migrating to like, this person's going to be good for the job. But we actually haven't done any assessment of this person's skills, right? Like any quantitative, objective way of saying, are you actually going to be good at this job? So a lot of companies have started to transition away from behavioral interviews and focus more on skills. So I don't know if my friend Michael's still on right now from the recruiting side of the business, but you know, and Brightwheel, our recruiting efforts are 100% like very heavily focused on skill assessment. So for my interview for Brightwheel, for example, being hired into this role, I had to do several projects. Like my first project was reviewing example data from a employee experience survey. They asked me to like analyze it and tell them what I saw from it, what recommendations I would have as an HR business partner based on looking at that data. They also gave me an annual performance review to read and provide feedback on as an HR business partner. So they basically were able to test my ability to do the job in these like smaller bite-sized projects that actually gave them a lot more insight on my process and the way in which I approach the work versus just sitting and talking to me about like who I am, what my story is, right? So they got a lot more data and evidence around my performance and my capability versus just being like, Sana seems great, let's hire her, right? Or Sana seems like someone I'd want to have a beer with, let's hire her, right? Those are some of the red flags, is like we should be able to really suss out like, okay, I saw Sana do these XYZ things with this annual review, which shows me she has XYZ skill, right? So really transitioning your reviews to be objective and really reducing opportunity for bias to creep in. Then let's talk about promotions. So typically with promotions, what I've seen a lot of companies do is like, they really love someone. This person's a rock star. Like Joy's been performing so well. She's doing great. Let's promote her, right? Versus saying, we as a business have XYZ opportunities or needs. Let's look at our entire bench of talent and assess based on their performance, who would be the best person for that job. Right? So how often are you actually promoting based on the person versus promoting based on the entire bench of talent and coming up with the best recommendation? So, you know, like this is also like a big trap that people fall into. And I think like, of course, occasionally there is going to be someone who is a rock star who should be promoted and there should be a kind of a path for them. But typically we should hold ourselves like pretty close to a process on how we promote people, right? We shouldn't just be like, being like, we really like this person, they're great, let's promote them. It should be, what opportunities exist in the business and who would be the best person for that opportunity from the entire bench of our talent. And I guess on the last side, like if you're someone who's approving these decisions, if you're approving hires, if you're approving promotions, what are you asking for as the justification and rationale to approve? What are you asking to see, right? If Rebecca comes to me and says, I want to promote Jose, what am I asking of Rebecca? Am I saying, cool, yeah, Jose is great. Like he had a great quarter. Let's promote him. Or am I saying, okay, tell me about like, what has Jose's performance been like for the last 12 months? What areas of weakness do you see? Where does he need to show some growth? Where is he doing really well? Also, tell me about your bench. Who else could you have picked from? Why did you pick Jose? Right? How often are we actually pushing and asking for data and evidence to really make sure that our managers and leaders are not just operating off of a bias or a reaction? They're actually like very much sussing out like who the right person is for whatever opportunity. Right? And this is again where I say like, yes, your gut and instinct will serve you well sometimes, but sometimes it will really lead you astray and not get you to the right decision. So really challenging your gut and instinct with actual evidence. Sometimes people come to me and they're like, well, this role is kind of like qualitative. I don't really have like super key like evidence or facts I can show you. Then I'm saying like, how are you evaluating this person? If you don't have like key metrics or key ways in which you're assessing out performance, how do you actually know they're a good performer, right? Like, how are you then telling me they're a good performer? So this is kind of like some of my general ideas on hiring and promotion, which again, I want to say is one of the most ripe areas for bias to creep in. Pause there. Questions or comments on hiring and promotions? Anything confusing here? Anything stand out? Okay, we can keep moving along. Ones, right? Like we all have one-on-ones. We meet with like our peers, we meet with our manager, we meet with our direct reports, whoever it is. Like we're all having one-on-one conversations occasionally. And I really want to hone in on these are really help someone feel a sense of belonging and psychological safety is your one-on-one conversations. My first piece of advice to managers when they have a new employee and they really want to make sure this employee ramps well is like get to know this person. Like who is this person outside of what do they care about? What's their story? What brought them to this company? What are their key goals for their time at this company? What are their value systems? Like what do they care about? What's important to them? How many of you feel like you could have been like, I mean, I'm just reflecting, like, I just don't think I would have ever felt psychologically safe most. Oh, re-recorded. So hope you're all okay with that. But really getting to know this person outside of work, I think is super important. And is usually one of the starting points for psychological safety. Like once you miss the boat on that and you just start jumping into work, it becomes really difficult to backtrack and be like, actually, because usually what happens is if you don't invest in this early on, there will inevitably be a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, something will happen and you'll be like, oh my God, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Like, I'd love to get to know you better to make sure going forward we can be aware of those things, right? So early on, invest in really building a good relationship. The second one, and I don't think this happens very often either, and this is incredibly important for diversity, is how do you prefer to share your ideas and feedback? How can I best make sure I get to really leverage your participation in the group? Do you like sharing feedback out loud in meetings? Do you prefer to get things in advance and share things via writing, like Google Docs comments? Like what is the preference for how you like receive information and how you like to share? Because I really want to make sure we don't miss out on your expertise, right? I think oftentimes we assume that like whatever the culture is of the company, that will work for everyone evenly, but really pausing and asking, right? Like what are your preferences? I think with neurodiversity, that's been a big piece of knowing like some people literally process information differently. And we have to be willing to ask, right? Like, what are your preferences on receiving information? And the last one, this one also sometimes doesn't always happen very consistently, is asking them like their preferences on receiving feedback. If you're a manager or a peer, I hope, right, where you have good practices where you're sharing feedback, ask them, what do you prefer? Do you want me to wait till the weekly one-on-one? Are you good with me just sending it to you on Slack? Do you like me going over it in a meeting and then giving you time to process and we talk about it more later? What is in the way in which you receive feedback? What's the best thing that you prefer? Do you want me to do it at the end of the week on Friday so you can like process it over the weekend? Do you want me to give it to you live right when it happens? Like what is the best way for you to receive this information? All of these things, right? Ultimately, like if my manager was doing all of these things with me, I would feel pretty darn safe with them. I'd feel like this person cares about me. They want me to be successful. They want me to make sure I feel like I'm a part of the team, and they want to make sure I'm heard. They want to make sure that they've hired me and that I actually contribute. So those are my ideas for one-on-ones. Any questions on those kind of one-on-one conversations? And by the way, I would say, managers are all on a journey here. If you're an individual contributor and you're reporting into someone, it's okay to spark this conversation yourself too, right? Some managers, for better or for worse, are new. They might be learning. This might not be an area that they're really good at. It's okay for you to set this up, right, in the early days and say, hey, I would just love to talk about our stories, who we are. I'd also love to talk about communication preferences, feedback preferences. Like, can we just talk about that up front so that we're all like on the same page? I think that's totally okay. And to me, that would signal you're a very high performing individual contributor because you're actually taking the time to set that up with me early on, right? So I know sometimes it feels like this is the manager's job, and in a lot of ways it is, but if the manager isn't doing it, it's okay for you as well, right, to drive this conversation in some ways. All right. How often to hold one-on-ones? I would say typically if you're managing someone, you should be having something once a week for 30 minutes minimum, right? Like it could be less, or more, but 30 minutes once a week seems like a fair flow. If you're not managing someone and it's not like a reporting relationship, but like a peer relationship, you could do like, once a month, once every 2 weeks, whatever it might be. I will say in the era of like post-COVID working remotely, like I just hope you all are just setting up social one-on-ones too, right? Like we should just be having one-on-ones just to chat and catch up on life and get to know people, because outside of that, I don't really know how else we're like ever having water cooler chat. Like it's just really impossible. So I hope you're actually scheduling these for yourself and also for your team, encouraging them to have these because, the burnout is real. People are really tired. And I think just these one-on-ones are sometimes where people can refuel. All right. I'm basically done. I'm going to stop now. I just want to say, inclusive leadership is a journey. We're all going to make mistakes along the way. But there is no way out of this, right? Like this is like the leadership of the future. There's going to be, a connection between inclusion and leadership, and there's a stake in the ground here. And I hope that you all feel a little bit more equipped, maybe even a little bit more uncomfortable or a little bit more nervous. That's okay with me. But just really feeling more intentionality around your sense of inclusion and how you're driving it in your day-to-day work. So thanks so much. I will stop here, and I can totally stay a little bit extra too, because I know I promised like 10 minutes, so we're at 8 minutes, but happy to take any questions if you want to pop them in the chat or turn your mic on. I thought Sarah had raised her hand, but maybe she's...
I did. Hello.
Oh. Okay.
Hi. Thank you for your time and your insight. I just had a question and bear with me while I articulate it.
Sure.
For when you were talking about promotions and making sure that you had, the performance indicators to be able to promote someone, I'm kind of wondering what your take is on, there's think pieces that women don't really get promoted based on performance because the tasks are different, and you should be promoting based on potential, and that's a big, I don't know, I've seen it a lot, right? It's just that idea of promoting on potential just because you the next level of that career is going to have ways for that person to demonstrate their skill. I'm kind of wondering what your take is and how that lands.
Yeah, I think potential is really difficult, from a bias perspective to control for. And this is what we've seen, right? Because people have weighed potential in performance and hiring decisions, we've seen men disproportionately benefit from that because we're more willing to bet on men and say oh, this person seems really confident. They might seem like they could grow into this role. Whereas with women, we're less willing to bet on potential. And so I actually kind of say like limit potential as a deciding factor for what you can really, measure. I think you can very much measure people's skill and experience, and you can dig into those things through some actual exercises or projects, or you can look at actual performance data. And that could be a proxy for potential. Like if you've seen, like for me, a good proxy for potential that really is reduced in bias is like, I saw this person going from not meeting expectations 2 quarters ago to now exceeding after being put on a performance plan. That demonstrates this to me that this person is capable of growing. That to me is a pretty solid case for potential. Like even if we're not fully sure that this person is ready for the role, but we believe they could grow into the role, that makes me more confident to see some performance history, and that's based in evidence and fact, versus just being like, I like this person. Like they just seem really confident. They seem hungry. Like let's give them a chance. Like that to me is a lot more like, well, tell me more. Like, right. So I think just asking questions and digging in, and we're not going to have perfect data. I'm so aware that like data is hard. It's really hard to gather information, and also can be very expensive and time consuming. And sometimes we don't have the time. But all I'm saying is like apply some rigor. Push back on someone when they come to you with that case and say, well, like, tell me more. Can you show me any evidence? Can you gather some examples? Can you show me some data? How are you gauging for potential, right? Like, what's your gauge? What's your proxy?
Right. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments, takeaways, things that you're walking away with? Courtney, go ahead. And Danielle after that.
Yes, Sana, thank you so much for taking the time to share. As someone who's interested in going into HR, I really appreciate all of the insights that you shared with us. And I did have a question. So I appreciate what you said about meetings kind of being like a representation of the culture at work, especially right now, a lot of people being on Zoom. That is really the only way we're interacting with each other in an in-person, like real-time setting.
Yeah.
I think everyone has had the experience of like being on Zoom and struggling to find people like being fully engaged or being fully present. Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of get across that, knowing that, this meeting that you're having with your team is likely going to be their impression of the company culture moving forward? And if someone keeps having kind of lackluster meetings because people feel disengaged on Zoom, like they're just going to start like progressively getting more disengaged. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that in particular?
Yeah. I mean, I just feel like there's a whole problem with like, there's just too many meetings and a lot of the meetings suck. Like in general, I'm not blaming anyone. Like there's just too many meetings and most of them suck. So have fewer meetings and make them better. So like be really, really intentional about what can happen async. I decline like several meetings a day where I'm like, this could be an email. Like, why don't you just Slack me these questions and I'll write you back? Or like, do we really have to have this meeting? Can this be something we can collaborate on like in Google Docs, right? Like just really pushing back on like what actually needs to be a meeting, because yes, people are burned out. I can't have that many meetings in a day. I suffer. When you put me in too many meetings, I look unhappy and I start, like not being helpful or productive. So reduce the number of meetings, and then also stakeholders in the meeting. Like, does everyone actually need to be in this? Like who really needs to be in this meeting and who will actually participate? Don't invite people to spectate. Right? Like if you're going to be spectating or having like people spectating, then you're like, maybe this should just be an email and people can read it. Right. And then maybe I can hold a 15-minute Q&A instead of holding a meeting to talk through an hour's worth of information where people are going to be spacing out anyways. Right. So I just think like reduce the meetings, reduce the window of the meeting, reduce the stakeholders in the meeting. And then I think quality goes up and engagement goes up. But I think being very intentional about meeting culture is like super important. It's like one of my things. I really love helping companies push on this, because I think like meetings are a really wonderful tool, but they get very overutilized and then the functionality just goes down. Daniela, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great discussion and the actionable items. I was curious about advice for when a company doesn't have an official like DEI role and that falls onto like a council or task force, what advice you might have for those participants and how they can like leverage when they don't have formal authority?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it happens because a lot of companies are not at that stage yet. I would say the biggest advice is I always say is find your ally in leadership. Like there's got to be someone who is in power, who has some influencing power, who can actually drive some outcomes. Find that person and start pushing on them. So ask for them to sponsor something, ask for them to put their name on something, ask for them to take on a specific task or project. But those councils and those informal groups need an executive sponsor. And then I would say if you can't find an executive sponsor, then you have a problem. If there's no one on the executive leadership team who's willing to put their name on a DEI effort, even if it's informal or something that's growing, that to me, I would say like step back and reflect, like, what is that telling you about the company and the culture? If there's no one on the executive leadership team who's willing to like informally sponsor or support a growing DEI group, that usually means that there needs to be a conversation to say like, what's going on? Like, I haven't been able to find someone who's willing to support this work. I'm curious, like, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean for the future of DEI at this company? Is there a future for DEI at this company? At what stage could we expect a DEI manager or a DEI hire, right? So that's when I would start asking questions. But I think like that's usually my first advice is find a sponsor so that you can actually get some, apply some pressure on the company to move on some certain things that are important. I think Dylan, you raised your hand. It's so nice to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you, Sana. And just at the risk, it's a comment, not a question, but at the risk of being a little bit of a fanboy, I appreciate your already established voice in this space, back to when I got to interview you 3 years ago, and now to watch you continue to evolve, because it's a tough topic. It's an important topic, but it's a tough topic. And I just wanted to kind of appreciate you out loud, sort of think globally, act locally. I really appreciated your message to, like there's this intention to make the world a better place at a global level, but then all the way down to like interactions in a meeting, and is a person's voice welcome and encouraged and supported and heard? So just, as a person who's always proud of our standout alum, I just appreciate watching you continue to make a difference in this very important space. So that's
Thank you. I so appreciate that. Thank you. And I think UCLA, specifically, I don't know if you all, how many students are on the line, but like Professor Benderski's classes really shaped a lot of my thinking on these topics. So she's amazing. She was the best faculty member I really interacted with. And I know now like DEI is evolving. Like I know Dean Heather Caruso was on here for a second, but it's really cool to see where Anderson's going to since I've left, and I'm super happy to see that. I want to answer Vanessa's question. So how do you respond to someone who's consistently bringing up people for promotion without data? How do you address their poor leadership and clear bias? I always say approach with curiosity, right? People are like not really good when you just say like, you're biased, like, what are you doing? But saying like, hey, like, I hear that you really feel highly about this person. You're excited about them. Can you tell me more? Can you give me some like examples? I'm just looking for some specifics, like across the 12-month window that you're looking at. What did you see that like specifically gave you so much confidence? Do you have any examples of like where they've exemplified this behavior, where they've demonstrated they have the skill, right? So if there are like qualifications for the job, for the promotion, whatever the new role is, ask, like, let's run down the list. Can you tell me? And you can do it with a lot of curiosity and hopefully that will like help that person learn like, oh, there's a way in which I need to like suss this out. But I think approaching with curiosity is always like a good first step. And then of course, if you feel like they're not open to it, or they're very clearly like, there's something unethical going on, like that's when you can always go to HR and ask for help, right? And saying, I don't think this person's making a decision that's in the best interest of the business. That's always something HR can also help with as well. So don't never feel like you're in it alone. HR is specifically around to help the company avoid risk in any situation like this, where we might be treating someone unfairly or treating someone with like preferential bias. Any other questions, comments? I know we're a little over time. Well, thanks everybody. I'm always around. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn, especially if you're a UCLA Anderson student. Like I care a lot about that community. Happy to give back. A lot of people gave to me, so happy to pass it forward. But thanks so much for the invitation again, Courtney and Sophia. It was wonderful. Really nice to see some familiar faces. And yeah, happy to answer any other questions separately on LinkedIn or anywhere else, but thank you.
Thank you so much for starting us off on such a great first session for Embracing Diversity Week. We really hope that everyone enjoyed this interactive session, and please go to the Engage's website to look up upcoming events that we have all week. We have another great event tonight called Out Proud and Totally Indigenous Data Scientists. So thank you all again for coming, and looking forward to seeing you at other sessions.